It's been at the heart of Donald Trump's defense since the beginning of the impeachment investigation. No quid pro quo, no wrongdoing. But today, his acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, seemed to admit that the White House did engage in a quid pro quo with Ukraine, withholding military aid not in exchange for information on Joe Biden, but rather for investigating whether a hacked server with Hillary Clinton's missing emails was being held in Ukraine.
Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy.
Mulvaney's comments came just moments before another major development in a different crisis for the administration, Turkey's attacks on Kurdish forces in Syria after U.S. troops left the region.
I'm proud to report, thanks to the strong leadership of President Donald Trump and the strong relationship between President Erdogan and Turkey and the United States of America, that today the United States and Turkey have agreed to a ceasefire in Syria.
Great day for the Kurds. It's really a great day for civilization.
The Kurds, as we learned yesterday from the president, are no angels. Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo negotiated the ceasefire today after a series of snubs from Turkish President Erdogan, who reportedly threw out a letter from Donald Trump demanding he not attack. But can you really claim victory for starting to mop up the mess you made in the first place? Now, there's been no shortage of people on both sides of the aisle questioning Trump's decision to pull U.S. troops out of the area, and all this has been raising questions about Trump's motivations, why we'd make decisions that seem to fly in the face of American interests at home and abroad. So we posed the question to NBC's Chuck Todd from Meet the Press on Boston Public Radio this morning.
There is one explanation. It's that he continues to implement Russia's foreign policy priorities. They had two big priorities when it came to dealing with the United States, Ukraine and Syria. And the president's inexplicable moves on foreign policy happen to be in which two countries? Ukraine and Syria.
So could Chuck be on to something? Joining me to discuss are Heather Cox Richardson, a political history professor at Boston College, author of To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party. Good to see you as always. And Middle East and North Africa consultant Nasser Weddady, who is son of the Mauritanian Ambassador, spent much of his childhood in Syria. It's great to see you as always. So is Chuck Todd on to something? Is President Trump just carrying out Putin's foreign policy?
Factually, he is doing Russia's bidding, because Russia, one of the greatest achievements of U.S. foreign policy in the past 50 years was America finding a foothold in the Middle East and ultimately ejecting the former Soviet Union. Now Russia is back, and President Trump has facilitated the Russian triumph there.
Because he believes in it, or because he wants to do Putin's bidding?
I think that it's a little bit of two or three factors mulled together, because ultimately the ideology of these guys, like the Trump Circle and that segment of the right, they've wanted to ditch the Middle East because they don't see any value into it. And the second reason ultimately is that President Trump has always thought that improving relationships with Russia and with Putin was a net plus for the United States, and because he completely abdicated the American role in the world and doesn't believe in any of that.
You know, Heather, when Chuck said it this morning, I was sort of shaking my head, and then we started getting flooding with emails reminding us of that moment in Helsinki earlier this week, learning behind closed doors that our acting ambassador to Ukraine worried that the president was trading the interests of Ukraine as part of some grand bargain with Russia. And then, of course, in February, there was the former acting director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, on with Anderson Cooper on CNN.
Do you still believe the president could be a Russian asset?
I think it's possible. I think that's why we started our investigation.
Now, McCabe's backed off a little, and surely Chuck Todd was not going that far. But do you buy this notion that he's just essentially an extension of Putin's foreign policy by intent?
Yes.
That's it?
I think it's the elephant in the room that we all have to talk about, yes. If you look at where we are now, I mean, one of the things that happens in human history is you take little steps that seem to make sense and you end up in a place you didn't expect to end up. And if you look at where we are now, the last 3 years have been extraordinarily beneficial for Vladimir Putin and not so good for America, for NATO, and for the EU.
So just bad judgment on Trump's part, or Trump deciding, I want to advance the foreign policy goals of Vladimir Putin?
Well, of course, I, like like my colleague here, thinks it's ideological. But in addition to being ideological, there's also the issue of the fact that the countries about which we're talking, Syria and Ukraine, are very rich in natural resources, especially in oil and natural gas. And I really think we must continue to look at the influence of Russia and Rosneft, their large oil company, in world affairs right now, because the things that have happened and the timing of things that have happened have been things that have happened to benefit Rosneft.
Well, let's talk about another elephant, the financial elephant. We know that Trump wanted to open a hotel in Moscow. He's got a residential tower in Istanbul. The reason I bring this up is one of the things that his acting chief of staff talked about today. He announced that the G7 meeting in 2020 would, lo and behold, be in Trump's Miami golf course. Here's Mulvaney.
There's plenty of other good places in this country to hold a large event. There's no question about it. There's limitations at other places. We thought of the 12 places that we looked at, and you'd recognize the names of them if we told you what they were, that this was by far and away the best choice.
You know, when my coworkers told me about this, because I was on the air when Mulvaney was speaking, I thought they were engaging in sort of humorous hyperbole. Then I saw it. I knew they weren't. And then I immediately go to the emoluments clause of the Constitution. We'll read in part, you know, you can't accept an emolument so-and-so and so-and-so from any king, prince, or foreign state. And to go on, there's a domestic emoluments clause in the Constitution. President can't receive any benefit except salary. How is having foreign leaders come to your golf course in Florida anything but an admission that I'm violating the United States Constitution? It is, isn't it?
All I could say is that I'm no constitutional expert.
Nor am I.
However, this is third world stuff. This is the kind of thing that you see, like, I grew up in different countries that had no democratic tradition, no democratic rule. At the time, we looked up to the United States for norms of governance, about how leaders can act in a moral, in a decent way, and that ultimately how not to use office for enrichment, because that's the norm in these countries. And as an American by choice, when I see things like this, I'm really heartbroken, because the values that we stood up around the world, and that like shining beacon on the hill is being dilapidated. So, and what I found most outrageous, that this is just going on, no one is bothered by it.
Well, it's not just a value, it's a constitutional mandate and a constitutional prohibition, which it seems to me. By the way, Mulvaney's answer was essentially he won't profit from it because he says he won't profit from it, literally.
Well, this is quite different than the previous emoluments problems that Trump has had, though, because this is the first time he has directly used the presidency for himself. In the past, other countries have stated as hotels or whatever. This is him saying we're going to do this with the government. But this, to me, is small potatoes compared to the real question of money laundering. And, you know, there's a very long story here of the problem of Putin being able to get his money through America because of what was called the Magnitsky Act. And the relationship of the Trump family businesses to the Russian financial world is, you know, has been written about a lot, but it's something we must be paying attention to, because while this we're talking about is, I hate to say small potatoes, a few $100 million.
Still a violation of the Constitution.
It's totally a violation of the Constitution. But if you're wondering why we might, for example, be looking at our Syrian and our Ukrainian policies in ways that we haven't in the past, I think the answer is not Trump Towers. The answer is money laundering.
And follow the money, as that old saying goes. One last thing. One other announcement, thing that Mulvaney spoke about, is yet again, he seemed on his face to say, even though we've been saying there's no quid pro quo, and citing Ambassador Sondland, who obviously today is saying, I have no idea if there's a quid pro quo. Donald Trump told me to say there was no quid pro quo. He seemed to suggest there was one, as I said at the top, not Joe Biden, but this investigation that he was demanding into this alleged this conspiracy theory about this DNC server being hacked and existing in Ukraine. Again, I know you're not a constitutional expert, you're not a legal expert, but is this not the textbook definition of quid pro quo?
I am neither of both, but I know a thing or two about politics. And it's quite obvious, like, why would the president engage in such behavior unless there was something in it for him? And by the way, this is Donald Trump, the guy who built a career on presenting himself as the deal maker.
But you were making a connection without a bridge. It seemed to me he provided the bridge today, and his response was, Mulvaney, I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy. It's going to happen. Elections have consequences. As crass as that is there any truth in that?
No. No, this is smashing the cases and grabbing the jewels before you run out the door. And I want to make the point, too, that yes, it's pretty clear there's a quid pro quo, not only with that quotation, but from other ones. But it doesn't matter, because it is illegal to solicit any...
To
That's
involve
right.
foreign powers.
Yeah, but
to ask for it.
Even if that's true, though, the Republicans are ones who are saying there needs to be a quid pro quo. So now they're in a position to respond to this.
That's lawyer talk.
It is lawyer talk.
All of us around the table know that when somebody's trying to get out of a tough position, they start like lawyering the details, the wordsmithing, and etc. The fact of the matter is that we have evidence that our president solicited foreign powers help into spying or airing the dirty laundry of political rivals. And this was focused on his chief main political rival in order to blacklist him and damage his political campaign in order to win the 2020 campaign. But in American terms, this is playing dirty and playing the dirtiest possible game.
And that's illegal.
It's good to see you.
Thank you for having us.
And arguably impeachable, we shall see. But as Gerald Ford said, his impeachment is what we say it is.